I'm really delighted to be here talking to two poets whose work I absolutely love for this event for Wandsworth Libraries for World Poetry Day. So I'd like to introduce Imogen Russell-Williams, who is an editor and children's literary critic, writing in publications including The Guardian, Times Literary Supplement, Metro. She is also the author of The Big Book of the UK, and her first poetry collection, The Women Left Behind, which I love, which she sent me a sneak preview of before it even came out, is out now, and it's illustrated by the amazing Chris Riddell. So that is Imogen, whose poem is in here, and I'm going to ask her to read it in a minute. And I'm also joined by the fabulous Deborah Alma, who is a poet and teacher who was the editor of two of my favourite ever anthologies, the Everyday Poet and the Emergency Poet. And she is also the editor of the Me Too anthology of poems by women and 10 Poems of Happiness, and co-editing with Dr. Katie Amiel, These Are the Hands, which is Poems from the Heart of the NHS, which I also included poems from in Night Feeds and Morning Songs. So I'm so delighted. She now runs the Poetry Pharmacy in Shropshire as well, where we are all going to take a trip as soon as we can. So thank you so much, both of you, for coming and talking to me today. I wanted to talk to you particularly about Night Feeds and Morning Songs, which both of you have very kindly given me a poem to go in here. And I'm going to ask you to read your poems in the book. And then I wanted to ask you a little bit about how motherhood had inspired or impacted on or otherwise affected, you know, your writing, your practice, and your kind of creative output. So Imogen, can I come to you first?
Certainly. Thank you very much for inviting me to chapter. It was lovely, and it's such a beautiful anthology as well, an inspired idea, and I'm so proud to be part of it. Very, very excited. Would you like me to just crack on and read my poem?
I'd love you to. And I'll say beforehand, actually, that Imogen's poem, we'd kind of put the anthology to bed, and then she tweeted this poem, and I just sent it straight over to my editor and said, oh, we have to have this. So I'm so glad we snuck it in.
Oh, I like the idea of being a disruptive poet. That's fabulous.
Like Indiana Jones's hat under the door.
Yeah, on brand in lots of ways. So my poem is called The First Shoes, and it is about shoes. The first shoes that you wore weren't even shoes, but socks printed with laces. Then you crawled and stumbled into blunt, bright moccasins. The first shoes that were worthy of the name, odd little things, so soft they flexed like gloves, were stitched about with warnings. Do not crush or warp or twist such tiny, tender feet, growing like mushrooms in the cradling dark. Then other firsts stacked like a deck of cards, wellies with reptile smiles, plastic glass slippers, dance glitter with a daring inch-high heel, pom-poms and plush, uncountable split sneakers, hot asphalt scuffs, backs casual trodden down, lone roads kicked off to trip us on the stairs. The first school shoes, the patent Mary Janes, grown up in photos under puddled socks, give way at speed to boots in which to run, to scramble up the vertical, to kick holes in the world and its enclosing walls. Now, for the first time, you are at my heels. Now your demure black shoe fits my whole foot. I realise how soon you'll walk away.
I just love it. I love it. And there's so many images there, the puddled socks, the reptile eyes in those welly boots that seem to be issued to all children. I just found it so kind of evocative and moving, and it's such a simple image to focus on, and it just says so much. Thank you so much for letting us include it. Deb, do you mind reading your poem?
No, not at all. I'd like to say how absolutely astonished I was to have poem included in the book, because it's not explicitly, is it, about motherhood, and it comes towards the end of the book. So I'm kind of quite keen to hear why you included it. Do you want me to read it first? And and then
Yes,
talk
please.
about your decision. Like, I think it's almost the penultimate poem, isn't it?
That's right.
And
It was nearly the last. It was nearly the closer. Not
gosh. Yeah, about coming back to yourself after all of those years of mothering little ones. So it's called She Describes Herself Like This. I still choose the window seat on buses, trains and planes. And though for now all I can see is my own reflection in the glass, in the fading light, sometimes I can see beyond it. I am a mother, a field, a house. Without me, windows darken. No one else knows how to put on lights just to bring the house to life. I am each of the processes of laundry, but most the unfolding in winter of sheets, a sudden punch of trapped summer on white linen, heat. I have had many lovers, and I have been many times loved. When I come, I cry out, and I am the sound of the wind in the trees, and I am the rain on the roof when in love or falling.
I just loved it as well. And it was very much, there's a short essay in the book that I wrote about sort of losing yourself in those early years of high maintenance madness, you know, sort of wondering who you are anymore and whether you're still going to be able to do any of the things that you did before, or whether your brain is porridge forever, you know, which was something that maybe not everyone does feel, but I know I did. And I loved that idea of, I'm the mother, I'm the only person who knows how to put the lights on, you know. So it was so something about the foundational, the functional things that you do, all the many things that you do that maybe people don't even notice that you're doing when you're in that role of mother. And coming back to yourself, you know, I'm still here. So thank you. I loved it so much. I remember, Deb, you saying to me quite a while ago that you decided to write poetry because you didn't have time when your children were young to sit down and write a whole novel. And that's, you know, then of course you're now a very successful poet. Your first collection, Dirty Laundry, which I love, is published by Nine Arches Press. And I wondered whether you still were sort of nurturing some desire to write a novel, or whether, you know, you felt you'd lighted on the right thing because of necessity at the time.
Well, it's a really interesting question. Poetry is just perfect, I think, if you consider yourself to be a writer or want to be a writer when you have young children, because you just about might have time for the fragments or the notes, and you can have a sense of completion, can't you, with one small poem. That but the novel was just pushed miles away. But now I mean I run a poetry pharmacy, so I've got another baby, so I haven't got time for a novel. I've got an idea, you know, but no, you know, I'm a poet, and I'm in a sense I'm grateful to have learned that. And there's something about the kind of tenderness of the small moments when you have young children that matches poetry better as well. You know, I think, I don't know, it feels similar.
Yes,
because everything has to be done in. Sorry, Imogen.
No, so I'm bounding in with both feet here, but I agree with that definitely. That there's so much heightened emotion in everything, whether that is the wild joy of a first little milestone, or the absolute despair of yet another plate of porridge that must be scraped up and chucked in the bin. Everything matters so much, but everything is also so small, and that is kind of poetry, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good way of putting it. And the fact that you get very adept when your children are small at compressing everything into 4-minute intervals. You know, like I always think, if you want something done, ask a busy mum, because she doesn't know whether she's going to get 20 minutes or 2 hours of nap time, but everything has to be done for the entire day. You know,
the danger when you get older is that you've become habituated to that, you know, so you're always kind of madly busy.
Filling all of those discrete 4-minute
I must do something practical or useful.
Yes, isn't that the truth? I have to sew when I watch TV because otherwise I feel guilty.
Listening to audiobooks as I walk so that I can use that time profitably, not just to walk and enjoy the walk and the exercise, but I'm doing something. The kind of, the multitasking does become very ingrained, I think. And did you find that it gave you things to write about? Were you keen to write about motherhood, or was it something, both of you, that you sort of found difficult to approach? I think it's hard to unpick how you're feeling at any one moment about such a big subject.
Well, I found that personally, I lost my dad when I was 21, so I had experienced this big seismic grief. And then when my daughter was born, it was the sort of the other side of that, the other end of that. And then I had a very, very strong sense of continuum and of more urgency than I'd had before. I'd always noodled around writing a bit of poetry, but I hadn't had the compulsion to try and get it down, write things, capture things, because life is a bloody, strenuous, unpredictable, crazy business. And if you don't do it, you may not get the chance. And I think that, having my daughter brought that home in a way that drove me in a way that I hadn't been driven before.
Wow, so it gave you that kind of focus, that urge to record it, because you were recording moments with her when things were changing so fast.
Yes, and moments of me as well. It wasn't just that I wanted to tell little tiny stories or distill moments for her, although that was part of it. It was also just if I, as an individual, want to tell some stories that are my stories, now is the time.
I think that's really fascinating. I've spoken to a lot of writers and poets and writers of fiction about this sort of over the last few years. And one of them said, actually, it had made her much more creative having her kids, because she said, you are so passionate about imagining a world that is perhaps something better or different than what we have, because you have that extra stake in it, that actually she found it was a real driver for creativity, of the sort of vulnerability and sort of big feelings that she'd experienced made her better at what she was doing. And I found that really interesting, because I think so often we hear about the pram in the hall and women's artistic careers being stymied by the demands of parenthood and the porridge brain that I definitely thought I had, and those kind of everything having to be fitted into discrete elements of time. But actually, the more I talk to people, the more they seem to find motherhood gave them a kind of wellspring of creativity and an urge to create something as well that would endure, beyond the moment.
Yeah.
Would you say that, Deb?
Well, not in. Well, yeah, it certainly did. It drove me into getting on with the thing that I wanted to do, which was to write. But I found when my children were little, my partner at the time was a workaholic, so I felt very much that I had them almost like as a single parent for a lot of the time, and I found it really difficult. Even though I wanted to write, I couldn't do it. I found I didn't have the time to write, and I became quite angry, and I started writing. I had to kind of commit to doing a creative writing degree in order to sort of put that time aside to take it seriously, when I think the youngest was about 7 or 8. So when they were really little, I had lost my writing completely, and I think I noticed things more. valued the small. I knew that those are the things I wanted to go on to write about, but I found it almost impossible to write about. And then when I started writing, I felt that I'd been so long with nappies and toys and pasta and pizza and school runs and all of that I didn't want to write about it. And in a way, the poem in the book is about me and moving on and traveling and all the other things I am, because I loved being at home with the kids. I absolutely loved it. And reading the book has taken me back to those wonderful, terrible, difficult moments. So it's, yeah. And there aren't books. There's no other book quite like it, is there? Actually,
it sort of seemed like such an obvious idea. I did have a look to check that there hadn't been hundreds of them already. There doesn't seem to be anything else out there that kind of does this spread of from sort of pregnancy right through to the empty nest. And I think what I loved about your poem, Deb, was that idea. I mean, partly because I've been locked down with my children for 7 months out of the last year, just the idea of being on a train on my own,
yes,
looking out the window and catching sight of my reflection seemed like an exotic fantasy that I could indulge for a minute and remember who I was, sort of, other than that. I mean, it's not comparable because I don't do anything creative in the way that writing fictional poetry is. But when I had to write the linking, sections in the book where I while the children were at home, I just can't do it. I can't string a sentence together in my head, even if they're not sort of bursting in through the door and demanding snacks. I found it really, really difficult without solitude and tranquility, which of course is in short supply.
I mean, I have to disagree with the idea that the work of the anthologist is not creative.
Absolutely,
it's very kind of you to say. But the reading and the sort of arranging and the choosing of the poems, all of that, I found there was no problem to do while they were in the house. But when I had to write literally a paragraph, anything that sort of introduced a poem or anything like that, it was impossible. So yes, they inspire, but then are also can be that pram in the hall can be then an impediment.
Yeah.
And as your children got older, Deborah, did you find yourself wanting to write more about the pizza and the pasta and that, or not?
I mean, I'm in my mid-50s now, and it's only now that I think I might want to write about. I think I only wrote 2 poems in all the poems I've written about the children, and I think is it Evan Boland has written about it at length, about how and is it Hélène Cixous? I don't know if you read her as well, about how.
Yes, she isn't in here though. Evan Boland is, and actually with her, it was so hard to get it down to. There may be 2 of hers in here, or just 1, but there were sort of half a dozen that I wanted really.
But they've written about how, as women, we can become victims of this. I suppose the kind of male preserve of talking of things about motherhood, birth, pregnancy, the small stuff of life as not being worthy of writing about. And I think, I mean, even talking to my son, who's 27 and should know better about doing this conversation, and about the book, he was slightly dismissive of it, and I had a good go at him. But, there is a kind of a bit of a stigma about it not being worth attention, and so I was victim to that, I think.
I really did find that a lot in my research. There's a brilliant anthology called Writing Motherhood by Carolyn Jess, which isn't just it's not just poetry, but it's all kinds of writing. And in the introduction to that, she writes about Sharon Olds, 2 poems of whom are in here, and which are just spectacular poems. And she got a rejection letter from a literary magazine saying, if you want to write about your children, maybe suggest the Ladies' Home Journal. Relatively recently,
terrible,
which I just found just sort of wildly astonishing. But because I've done other anthologies of women's poetry and have seen how that has been undervalued and forgotten about or overlooked or neglected, you know, and if women wrote at all, it was supposed to be about those subjects that were considered their preserve, but then they're not proper subjects, so it doesn't sort of become canonical, or, you know, it really struck home. And then Kim Moore, whose poem is in here, who was another poet like Imogen, who I stalked on Twitter and said, oh gosh, this is wonderful, we've got to have this. She said quite recently, she tweeted when she received a copy of the book, and said, you know, when I got pregnant, a lot of male writers said to me, oh, I suppose you're only going to write about babies now. And, you know, and I did write about babies and other things. And this is, you know, one in the eye for everyone who kind of said that women couldn't, what women write about, if they're writing about domestic and emotional and those elements of motherhood, isn't worthwhile. Did you feel that as well, Imogen?
I've definitely come across the idea that all this is, you know, somehow dainty and twee. And all I want to say to those people is, have you ever given birth? I mean, for
twee and dainty.
Just there is nothing more elemental than the process of growing a child in your womb, giving birth to that child, feeding that child. I can't remember who said it, which is really shocking because it is a poet and a brilliant poet, but the woman who said to all the men who said that writing about babies and children was sentimental, you know, breast milk's made of blood. And that really resonated with me, and I apologize that I've forgotten her name. But this is not dainty stuff. This is quite literally the stuff of life. We're not putting up with any of that nonsense.
I mean, it does seem kind of extraordinary that the whole area of the domestic and this, you know, enormous, you know, the enormous wild kind of madness of motherhood, it just hasn't been seen as a valid subject for certainly poetry, I would say, perhaps more. And actually it was difficult because I always like to include quite a wide variety of voices from different centuries, ideally, but there's very little from earlier, you know, eras that does focus on this, partly because women didn't write as much, they didn't publish as much, or their poems were sort of overlooked and neglected, but also I think because specifically on this subject it just wasn't considered proper stuff.
No, sanitized, hidden away, concealed, made nice.
Absolutely. Daintied.
Yeah.
And I think I found it really exciting, actually, editing this, how many new poets I discovered and how many poets writing today are writing about this subject, because it does feel like, I'm probably feeling this particularly strongly at the moment as we emerge from homeschooling. It does feel like mothers haven't had their voices listened to. I was trying to write something earlier today and talking about the idea of mothers meeting, which is never implied to be a big serious meeting where important things get discussed. You know, that's a very dismissive phrase. And the parents who were told not to gossip at the school gates by Gavin Williamson recently, it's only the mums who are being told not to gossip. You know, we know that. And the kind of complete lack of childcare, you know, thought about the logistics of childcare from the government over this last sort of period. So it does feel that women mothers are not being heard. So it was a nice thing to do this and send it out there in the hope that everyone who's had a really, really tough year in so many different ways, you know, the women who've given birth alone and had to deal with that kind of baby stage without the community that, you know, I certainly relied on when mine were tiny, and people apart from their own mums, you know.
Yeah, so I think it's a really important book, actually, Anna. I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's such a range of voices and honest and raw and beautiful, I think. And you know, I'll be using it a lot in and giving it to lots of people, and I think it's fantastic.
You'll prescribe it at the pharmacy.
I will.
That's a wonderful idea. That makes me very happy.
Well, yes, I'm always delighted when there's another resource that I can use, because there was this gap. Where do I go? I mean, there are anthologies of motherhood, aren't they? But they're from all different perspectives, and they're about difficult relationships with mothers or the death of a mother. But there's nothing else like this. So very timely.
And what you were saying about the community that you relied on, and which definitely rings true for me as well. And the title is so lovely, because the night feeds, the times when you feel as though you are the only person alive in the world other than your baby. And it's just a surreal sense of complete isolation and the world made strange. And tapping into that just in the title itself tells the people who might need this book that it is for them. It's so wonderful.
Oh, I'm so glad you like it. I have to say, those Night Feeds poems were the ones that I found really quite viscerally took me back to that sort of those kind of times where you've just parachuted out of what you recognized as your life.
Yeah. And
the idea, because there are actually quite a lot of night feeding poems in here, because it obviously was a time when, I suppose it's a quiet time. Ideally it's quiet, I mean, it's not always quiet, where you do have that kind of extra layer of solitude. You feel like the whole world is asleep, and just knowing, reading about all the people who've done that before you and would do it again after you, and that did make it feel like a sort of literary community in that way.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that I've got anything else that I wanted to ask you. Was there anything else that you wanted to say, either of you?
I don't think so. I am so happy that there's not that it required legitimacy to be conferred on it, but I'm so glad that I'm going to choose to think of this as the not even the thin end of the wedge, the crowbar to open the door, so that people can write about motherhood, and dads can write about the early experience of parenthood too, and this can be something that is held in common and prized and treasured, rather than sneaked off into an alcove marked not really proper art. Because I think we've done with that, haven't we?
I really hope so. And I do think there is that like Holly McNeish's amazing book, Nobody Told Me, the title of that book as well, Nobody Told Me, and I just think I've given that to so many women, expecting babies and who just have had babies, and the enormous success of that book, which I think I've read that she took a few attempts to find a publisher for, because it was considered rather niche, which has sort of subsequently become such a touchstone that I think has been passed between women, and maybe we can tell each other.
Yeah, and it's a beautifully produced book. It'll sit, proudly on a shelf, and it will act as gatekeeper to all of the others that come after it as well, and all the poets that will be given permission to write, which I wasn't actually. Even I'm a lot older than you, but I knew that if I were going to dwell in that territory, that it was unlikely to be published back then, and I don't think that's true now. And you were talking about Kim Moore and people like Helen Moore with their established poets are writing about it and being respected for writing about it. So great, good for us all, really.
I'd like to thank both of you for coming along and talking to me today, or staying at home and talking to me today. And also for, thank you for letting me include your poems in this book. Both of them were just ones that really kind of spoke to me on a really personal level. They both gave me such vivid kind of pictures in my head, which is what I always look for in a poem. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. And it was
Happy World Poetry Day,
Deborah, and Happy World Poetry Day. And I love the processes of laundry. I love the processes of laundry. I really
I'm obsessed with laundry. Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much. It's been really lovely to talk to you both.